Did President Trump have the constitutional authority to do what he did last night in Iran? Well, there is no easy answer. Of course, you can have your opinions about it, but the truth is there are facts on both sides of this argument that would support either opinion. And you need to keep in mind, this is not just a legal issue, there's also a political calculation too. So let's break it all down and talk about all of it. And yes, this is absolutely a deep dive, so pull up a chair and buckle up. There are some basic facts that we can all agree on. Last night, President Trump authorized Operation Midnight Hammer, which included, according to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 7 B-2 bombers, 4th and 5th generation aircraft, 14 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, or MOPS, Tomahawk missiles launched from a nearby Navy sub, and several sets of decoy aircraft. The chairman said the goal of the mission was to degrade Iran's nuclear capability. He said the mission was successful in hitting 3 of Iran's nuclear sites, but a full damage assessment has not yet been completed. The next 2 points I'm going to make here are critical for you to understand before you form your opinion about whether Trump has the authority to take this action without the approval of Congress. 1, the Trump administration is stressing this is one and done. The president and secretary of defense said they had a narrow window of opportunity and that Iran's nuclear capability was an imminent threat to United States national security, and that's why they had to act right away and not wait for congressional debate on the issue. According to Secretary Hegseth, key members of Congress were informed the strike had happened after the bombs had already dropped and the pilots were already on their way home. And 2, while we got a big boom and big explosions in Iran at those 3 nuclear sites, that does not necessarily mean that Iran's nuclear material was even there. Nor do we know if this strike crippled that nuclear capacity in any way. The Iranians could have easily moved all that stuff to another site long before all of this happened, and there is some reporting today that says that's exactly what they did. Now, I promise those 2 issues are critical here when you calculate whether Trump had the authority to do what he did without Congress. And here's where it gets complicated. The fact is the Constitution divides war powers between Congress and the president. They both have significant power here. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the sole power to declare war, but the Constitution also says the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States military, and there are several laws that govern how the president can use that military. There is the War Powers Resolution of 1973, and then the Authorization for Use of Military Force of 2001. Most people call it the AUMF. So the War Powers Resolution is a law that limits the president's power to commit the United States Armed Forces to military action without congressional approval. It says a president can launch military attacks in only 3 circumstances: if Congress declares war, if Congress specifically authorizes it, or if there is a national emergency created by an attack on the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. It is important for you to know that this law does not say that the president must seek approval from Congress to authorize a strike. All this law says is the president must notify key members of Congress within 48 hours of deploying troops to a hostile situation or initiating a strike. The law says that military action can only continue for 60 days unless Congress has officially declared a war or has expressly approved that military action. If Congress has done neither of those things, then the president has 30 days to withdraw those forces. The other law that applies in this situation is the AUMF. So after the September 11th attacks, Congress passed the AUMF, which at the time authorized President George W. Bush to continue using military force against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and other individuals, organizations, and countries that planned, authorized, committed, or aided in the 9/11 attacks or harbored those responsible. But because of the way the AUMF is written, it has given other presidents who have come into office after George W. Bush cover for decades to continue to justify other attacks on associated forces in places like Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya, and in Pakistan without going to Congress first. Now, while Congress has bitched and moaned for years about presidents issuing strikes without their congressional approval, despite multiple attempts, Congress has failed to repeal or even narrow the scope of the AUMF. So now that you know the situation and the law, the question that needs to be answered for you to determine whether you think Trump has the constitutional authority to do what he did last night is, did Operation Midnight Hammer start or enter the United States into a war with Iran, or is this, in fact, as Trump says, just a one-time strike? Well, that's going to depend on what happens next. Just because President Trump says this is one and done does not mean that's how Iran sees it. And if Iran launches some kind of retaliation that forces the United States to respond militarily, that it's going to be politically difficult for Trump to say this is not a war. And obviously, if it is a war, the Constitution is pretty clear that Congress must declare it. But since we don't know yet, that leaves the question of whether Trump should have done this without congressional approval up for debate. And when you form your opinion about whether he should or should not have done it, you should consider three things. One, we know Trump did not seek authorization from Congress to conduct this strike. But yes, he did notify the proper members of Congress of the strike as required under the War Powers Act. Two, President Trump justified his decision to strike Iran by saying Iran and its proxies have been attacking U.S. service members and assets for years and claimed that there was an immediate threat to U.S. national security. Trump has been saying this week that Iran is weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon, but even his own intelligence agencies, our own American spies, have testified under oath recently that while Iran does have nuclear material at unprecedented levels, they were not close to having a nuclear weapon. Three, Trump isn't the only president to order strikes like this by using national security as justification. President Biden did it in Syria. President Trump did it during his first term against Iran. President Obama did it in Libya, and the list goes on and on. And all of them used threats to the United States national security as justification for not getting congressional approval ahead of time. They all had a justification or an excuse for doing it at the time. So those are your three things that you should consider. Lastly, aside from the are we, aren't we at war issue, I just want to mention the political calculation in all of this. It is, of course, always better for a president to have congressional approval or at least congressional buy-in before authorizing a strike like this. That obviously doesn't always happen, but politically, it's always better. The other political calculation in this situation is President Trump promised on the campaign trail that he would not drag the United States into another war in the Middle East. And as we have seen, the president's base of supporters and even some Republicans in Congress are definitely divided on whether Trump is going against his own campaign promise by authorizing Operation Midnight Hammer. In fact, we may see some action on the floor of the House and the Senate this week to try and restrain Trump from acting any further.